in person. And then, so all being well, we'll finish at 12:30, for those of you here, with lunch as well. So now I will pass you over to Lexi Shaw for the first session.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Is that okay, volume-wise? Everyone able to hear me? Perfect. Up a little bit. All right. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. My name's Lexi Shaw. I'm managing partner at AC Mole. And actually, until earlier this year, for about 10 years, I'd headed up our charities team, and it was a great pleasure to do so. But this year, it's even been more of a pleasure to hand over the reins to my colleague, Sarah. So before I started on my session, and in fact, I haven't picked up my clicker, so apologies, I take that. I just wanted to take a moment, actually, to acknowledge Sarah and also all of the charities team here. As Sarah mentioned, we deal with a really wide range of charities, and literally pretty much every day I see Sarah and all of the rest of the team going above and beyond in terms of client service to help out those charities. Sarah's been at AC Mole now for 20 years and qualified, I think, back in 2009, and was awarded the Diploma in Charity Accounting back in 2019. Which recognises experts in the charity sector. And it would be fair to say that Sarah is a real expert in the sector. She's a fantastic resource, not only for me, but for all of the team and for all of our clients as well. So I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate Sarah on her promotion to head of the team. Thank you. So yes, setting the scene. As with last year, I thought we'd start just with reflecting on the wider economic environment and the scene in which sets the background, I suppose, for which charities are operating in at the moment. And it's been 10 years since I've been based here in Somerset working in the charity sector, and 25 years as a whole across my career. And actually there's been quite a lot of change in that time. I reflected the other day, I did a presentation at my son's school for all the 16-year-olds who were all keen and eager and bright-eyed and heading out into the world. And I reflected that when I was their age, actually the internet had just been invented and was just starting. It makes me feel very old. But obviously, that's had a massive impact over the course of my career in terms of, how I've worked in organisations. And of course, that generation is now looking at the advent of AI and the impact that that's going to have over that period as well. So there's been lots of change, and I think it's tempting sometimes, from a charity perspective, to kind of sit in isolation to that change. But obviously all of that change has a really massive impact on your beneficiaries, on your staff, on your volunteers, and therefore on your organisation as a whole. So I do think it's really relevant as a charity to reflect on those wider impacts and how they're affecting your organisation. So, setting the scene. I was going to start with a question, actually. So every year, the Collins Dictionary comes up with new words. So there's 10 words a year on the whole that are included into the dictionary, and they have a word of the year. Does anybody know what the word of the year was for 2022? Say again? Riz. No, it wasn't, actually. No, what is that word? I don't even know. Yeah. Riz. Is it? Oh, really? Oh, I got that wrong then. I thought it was AI. Okay. So any other takers? So no. So it was actually permacrisis. Oh, did somebody come up with that? Oh, well done. Oh, maybe a cross-on or something at the end. No. So permacrisis. The definition of permacrisis is an extended period of instability and insecurity, and it has definitely been a turbulent few years when you sit back and reflect on it. We've had Brexit, we'd have government and political changes, we've had the war in Europe, and more recently, the war in the Middle East. We've seen the financial crisis. This time last year, we had the Bank of England intervening in the bond markets. We've seen the energy crisis and the cost of living. We've seen the pandemic, and obviously we've also got the ongoing climate crisis. So it would be fair to say that there's a lot going on. And this is very much become a new normal environment in which we're operating. And sometimes it's funny when you sit back and reflect how many things there have been actually in that sense of a permanent crisis, and actually almost taking time to reflect and on how well we've weathered that storm and perhaps pat ourselves on the back a little bit that we've seen through all of those changes and all of those crises, and we're all still here. But also time to reflect a little bit and look ahead and see what impact they will have going forward as well. So I thought I'd start, you'll forgive me, I'm an accountant, so I thought I'd start by looking at the UK economy. And of course we had the autumn statement just over a week or so ago. And there were some really interesting points coming out of that actually that I wanted to touch on. So obviously the autumn statement announced that inflation has dropped, I think, which came as good news for the Chancellor. So we're now at 4.6% in October, which was a fall of over half, which was obviously the target that was set, but from 11% last year, which was a 40-year high. And if you look at the chart, the lighter blue line is the forecast. So there was a forecast fall, but actually the darker blue line is the actual levels of inflation. So although it has fallen, it hasn't quite fallen as quickly as was forecast, or indeed as was perhaps hoped. But it is fair to say that we're looking a little bit better now than we did this year, and this time last year, sorry. And I remember standing up here this time last year and talking about inflation being 11% and looking forward. So it is nice to be in a more positive position. The other point that I think is very relevant is around the Bank of England and the base rate. And actually, this was stable from August of this year to November of this year. So it didn't increase during that time, which might not sound like a lot, but that's the first time since December 2021 that the base rate hasn't increased. So it's the first time that we've had a period of over 3 months of stability in a Bank of England base rate during that period. So obviously things are settling down, but only really starting to do so now. And I'll look into some of the detail of how that can impact your organisation. I wanted to refer back to the inflation chart, if I may, because what the government didn't do in the autumn statement, I think this was somewhat overlooked in some corners, was that what they didn't do was announce an increase in public spending to match the increases in inflation. And this was a change from the March statement, and really actually quite a significant change. What that means, therefore, is cuts in real term in public sector spending going forward. The size of those cuts is 19 billion per year by 2027-28. Now, it's difficult when you talk about government spending, what's 1 million, 1 billion. So to give that some context, that is the current spend of the Home Office and HMRC per year combined. So that was the level of cuts which are included in the government's forecasts, which are announced in the autumn statement. Now, unsurprisingly, the chief executive of Pro Bono Economics commented on it and said, well, actually, the crisis in public services has been swept under the carpet here. And I don't think that's an unfair comment. We've obviously got a backlog in the courts, about 60,000 cases backlog. We've got real challenges in housing services. We've had a doubling of the number of households in temporary accommodation in recent years. The police and children's services are seeing an increase in their requests for their support of an average of around 9% on annum. And obviously there are real challenges faced in the NHS as well. So in the scope of those challenges, those reductions are really quite significant. And it's not surprising, therefore, if you read between the lines in the Office of Budget Responsibilities report, the OBR's report, they expressed, they felt that these forecasts were perhaps somewhat optimistic. And indeed, they said that there are significant and growing risk to their forecast was the ability to achieve these real-term cuts in public spending. There were some papers that referred to it as a budget to destroy a future chancellor, which is perhaps a little harsh. But however you consider those above, it is fair to say that achieving £19 billion of savings is going to be a real challenge. But what was very interesting is in the papers this morning, Sir Keir Starmer is due to do a speech actually around the financial economy today. And some aspects of that were leaked to the press, and his statement was that he is not going to turn on the spending taps. The Labour government does not intend to turn on the spending taps. So actually, yes. Is that better for you? I'll speak up a little louder as well. Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll move this somewhat. How's that? Is that better? Okay, lovely. Thank you. So yes, it was interesting that a Labour government has already said they will not turn on the spending taps. So if you put those two together, it does imply potential for further periods of real austerity in terms of public sector spending. So why is that relevant from a charity perspective? Well, of course, many of the government services are outsourced to charities to be delivered. In fact, billions of pounds worth of contracts are outsourced to the public sector each year. Now, we have already seen, and this slide shows charity income from local government over the last 10 years, we've already seen a decline of over £2 billion during that period. And I know certainly speaking to charities who are involved in delivering public sector contracts or receive local authority funding, they've not seen, many of them, inflationary increases to those contracts during that time. So that squeeze, those pressures are being passed on to charities who are delivering these services. And in fact, when surveyed, 73% of charities who provide government services already said they cannot meet demand with the funding they currently receive. And so many charities are topping up these services and subsidising them, essentially, with income from other sources. And obviously, we've also seen 11 local authorities go bankrupt since 2018. And there are arguments around some of the investment decisions perhaps made by those local authorities and the impact that they've had on their financial stability, but actually increasingly those local authorities are coming under pressure as well. And the statistics imply that 1 in 10 local authorities face either further significant cuts in public spending or basically essentially bankruptcy. So some real challenges ahead, I think, to the sector as a whole. And for those charities that provide services through local authority contracts or indeed are reliant on funding from local government, I think these trends and these statistics and an understanding of some of those forecasts on the level of public sector spending in the years to come are really quite important framework when looking at your long-term strategy and indeed funding sources. And those challenges obviously come at the same time when household incomes are falling. So despite an improvement from the March forecast to the autumn statement, the Office of Budget Responsibility is still forecasting a further reduction in disposable household income in 2024-25. That's on top of the reductions that we have already seen. Essentially, that's giving us the largest reduction in household disposable income since records began for the ONS, which was back in the 60s. So the recovery, when it comes, will be slow, and this chart shows household disposable income, but the pink line was the pre-COVID trend, and obviously the bottom line is the current trend. But essentially, when that recovery comes, it is forecast to be very slow, with household income not reaching pre-pandemic levels until 2028. And by 2029, household incomes being £10,000 per annum worse off than they were before the COVID crisis. And I think one of the scary statistics for me is around the amount of disposable household income that's being spent on debt repayments. That is forecast to double by 2027-28, taking us up to levels that were only last seen after the last financial crisis. So it's unsurprising then, given that wider economic environment and the strains on household income, that is impacting charitable giving. This is a survey which is undertaken by a government department, the DCMS, and it's their community life survey. And it surveys quite a wide range of the population, and basically was asking the question, what percentage of the population have given money to charity in the last 12 months? So back in 2013-14, that figure was 82% of the population had donated money in the last 12 months. That dropped to 63% at the height of the pandemic, and has now obviously increased somewhat back up to 66%, but obviously quite a significant reduction over that 10-year period. Now, what I would say, I don't want to be all doom and gloom this morning, and on a positive note, the UK does actually rank third in the world on the CAF giving index, World Giving Index, which is actually a statistic I think we should be really proud of. We sit, I think, behind Indonesia and Myanmar in terms of having the highest proportion of our population that give money to charity in a 12-month period. So I think that culture of philanthropy that we've got in the UK, and the fact that sustains some of the challenges that we've had in recent years, is something that we should be really proud of as a nation. Our volunteering statistics aren't quite as positive, but I'll perhaps come on those later. But we definitely still have that culture of giving money to charity, which is fantastic. But obviously that's anecdotal evidence from surveys, but actually it's holding out in practice as well. And I know I put this slide up last year for those of you who are here, but the trend continues. This is the amount of money that Children in Need has raised from its on-the-night donations each year. And you can see that back in 2018, that was £50 million. This year, it fell again to £33 million. And if you increased that for inflation during that period, you would expect an equivalent figure, if you were an equivalent to what they'd raised back in 2018, to be 63 million. So a real trend there in terms of the drop in donations and giving on a year-on-year basis. That obviously then looking at the charity sector and income there as a whole. Income for the charity sector fell last year. That's the dark blue line on the slide there, which is as you would expect. The modelling looking forward in terms of where income for the sector is expected to go, this has been undertaken by Pro Bono Economics, that does see an increase next year, but it's an increase of 1%. So it's pretty sluggish. And on top of that, the difference between, again, the pink line being the pre-COVID forecasts and the lower line being our current position, that equates to £9 billion less income for the sector, so 13% by 2024. So there are some real challenges around income for the sector as a whole. And I suppose then in the context of that reduction in income, the charity sector is also seeing quite a significant increase in demand. This chart is from the Citizens Advice Bureau, and it shows the referrals that they give on a month-by-month basis, and it dates back to April 2014, so it's the last 10 years. And I know last year I also talked about the Citizens Advice Bureau and how they were saying at the time they'd had record levels of demand. Well, actually, this has only continued. The yellow colours there are referrals for energy support. So as you would expect, those have increased quite significantly in recent years with the energy crisis. But the green colour there, that's referrals to charities and food banks. And you can see how that trend and how the level of referrals has increased really quite significantly over that 10-year period. In terms of cumulative referrals, well, by October 2023, the Citizens Advice Bureau had referred over 190,000 people for charitable support and food banks. It's a record level for them and more than they've ever referred in any other year on record. And by comparison, back in 2019, they referred about 50,000 people in total. So that gives some context of the level of demand which is still being seen in the sector. And obviously that figure of 190,000 was October, so that's before the real winter pressures and the increases that they typically see in November and December. So it's really important, I think, to acknowledge the impact that some of those economic challenges that we talked about earlier are having on those who are really suffering from the cost of living crisis. And that demand, I think, is mirrored across the sector as a whole, in general. Pro Bono Economics did a survey of 600 charities, and this is done by size. So but on the left-hand side of the slide, there's small is at the top, medium at the middle, and large at the bottom. And the blue lines are those charities who responded and said that they had seen an increase in demand. This is in the last 12 months as well, so this is recent increases in demand. And 75% of medium and large-sized charities had seen an increase in demand compared to last year. So those challenges really translating into increases in demand for charity services and support across the sector as a whole. But what I would say is that same survey also found that charities felt better placed to meet that demand and actually had more confidence in doing so. And I think that is full credit, actually, to the sector in the face of those challenges, that actually we've absorbed and are dealing with that demand and those requests for help. And that confidence is reflected in a little bit around charity finances as well, where there are some signs of optimism and perhaps a hope that we may have weathered the worst of the storm. So this is a survey, and you'll forgive me, I do like a graph, but I do think they're useful context for some of the figures. This is a survey which was done, again, by size of charity, so small charities at the top, large charities at the bottom. And the question asked was, are you expecting your finances to deteriorate in the near future? And what's important to know is if you look at the bottom there, the large charities, so back in November 22, almost 60% of large charities thought that their finances were going to deteriorate. And when asked the same question in September of this year, that had dropped to 30%. So quite a significant shift, and you can see it across all sizes of charities. The dark blue dot being the November polling and the pink dot being the September one. So I think we are heading into this winter with a degree more of optimism. But it is fair to say that there are some challenges which remain. And I guess talking about that resilience then that charities have shown during that period, CAF did a really interesting survey around charity resilience and speaking to charity leaders about their experience of the last 12 and 24 months, the cost of living crisis, what adjustments that they'd made during that time. And it was really interesting to see what they found. And that demand, which we talked about earlier, definitely seems to still be there. So 59% of charities surveyed had seen an increase in demand compared to last year. 53% were worried about continuing in the current economic climate. But I think more worrying for me was the statistics that 26% had made cuts to services. And indeed, 12% had said that they'd had to turn people away. 41% of charities said that they didn't feel that they could help anyone else. So some real challenges for charities at the moment. But on a brighter note, the sector is actually holding up really well, I think, in the face of some of those really quite significant challenges. And that same survey found that more charities were feeling confident about their ability to cope with the effects of the crisis. And in fact, 75% surveyed said that their board and senior management were confident about managing the challenges and the impact that that had on the organisation. Also, what I found really interesting was 36% had developed a detailed plan to face the cost of living crises. Now, I don't know whether that's something that your charities have done or the charities you're involved with have done, but I thought it was quite interesting, actually, that that percentage of charities had gone away and done that. And in terms of financial outlook, again, then this is just really to illustrate a trend. But the question asked was whether they expected their financial outlook to improve. And again, it was asked at 3 dates, actually, so November 22, February 23, and May 23. And you can see there the trend in terms of the darker colours at the top being those charities that thought that their financial outlook was going to improve. So there is really optimism there and a trend in more optimism across the sector as a whole. But despite that optimism, as we've noticed, there are still some real challenges around donations. And CAF have done a UK giving report, which is, again, very interesting read. And this looked at the overall level of participation in charities within the UK, so both in terms of financial giving, but also volunteering time as well. And that found that donation levels and engagement with charities had not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So overall level of participation, so these are people being involved in any form in charitable activities, was 84%. And that was very consistent, really, with last year. It was around 83%, but it still represented a fall from pre-pandemic engagement of 5%. And the reason I think that's quite significant from a survey perspective is this survey didn't just look at financial giving, it looked at the giving of time as well, the giving of volunteering. And obviously the sector as a whole is hugely reliant on volunteers. And so any trend in terms of the level of engagement of volunteering, I do think is worth looking at. And indeed the report went on to look at that further. And it found a sustained reduction in volunteering levels. It looked at the engagement in formal volunteering only, in terms of these statistics, but it found that 16% of people had volunteered formally in the last 12 months, back in 2018, but that had fallen to 13% of the population more recently, which by their estimates translated to 1.6 million fewer people volunteering in a formal role, which is really quite significant in that time. Now, I did a little bit more research on the back of that, and I found another survey which the NCVO had undertaken, the Civil Society Almanac, which again questions, it's a very broad survey across the UK around involvement in volunteering. Their statistics were that 14.2 million people had volunteered at least once through a club, group or organisation, either formally or informally, but that statistic that I put up last year, only last year, that equivalent figure was 16.3 million. They also found a rate of decline in formal volunteering, their statistics being slightly different, but the figures are still there, and an increase in informal volunteering during that time as well. Now, those surveys really looked around the last couple of years, and I think it would be fair to say that the pandemic had quite a significant impact during that time, both on formal volunteering, particularly with the vaccine rolled out, and informal volunteering. So I thought, well, let's go away and look at it over perhaps a longer period. And I went back to this Community Life Survey, which is undertaken by the DCMS, and that covers a 10-year period. And that also looks at volunteering. And the trends there were exactly the same, but this is over a 10-year period now. So back in 2013, 70% of the population said that they had been involved in some form of volunteering in the last 12 months. Last year, that dropped to 55%. So the orange line is just involvement within the last year. The blue line is involvement, in the last month. So a real trend there in terms of a reduction over that 10-year period in engagement in volunteering. The statistics for formal volunteering were very similar. So they had 45% engaged in formal volunteering back in 2013-14, and that dropping to 27% in their most recent survey. So a real reduction there. And obviously there are different surveys, there are different figures, they all work out different numbers, but essentially the trends are the same. They're all showing the same, which is a real reduction in people giving their time. And as I mentioned, the UK doesn't rank as well when we come to volunteering. We rank 58th, actually, in the CAF World Index in terms of the percentage of people that are involved in giving our time. So we're not coming from a particularly good starting point, and we're seeing that reduction. So unsurprisingly then, when surveyed, a lot of charities said, well, actually, the ability to recruit volunteers is actually becoming an increasing concern. And again, this survey was done at two different data points. So the darker points are November 22, the dark blue, and the pink is September 23. And it's done by size of charities, so small at the top, medium and low. And you'll see there that small charities, by the end of September 23, 60% of small charities were saying that they were concerned or very concerned about their ability to recruit volunteers. And actually, when you think about the reliance of charity on volunteers, that becomes quite significant. But it's also noticeable to see the real difference that makes to charities by size, and that it's less of a concern for larger organisations. But for smaller charities, it really is becoming an issue. And again, then, when surveyed, those charities that said they were concerned about volunteers actually said that it was their main concern. So 60% of small charities said that their main concern was now the ability to recruit volunteers. And given the percentages of charities, I think they'd said 91% of charities, of small charities, are reliant on volunteers to keep going, and 57% of larger charities. But I wondered around the room, perhaps by a show of hands, how many of the charities here are reliant on volunteers to keep going, or is it an essential part of your... Yeah, almost the vast majority, I would say, exactly. So I think those trends in terms of volunteering are really relevant to everybody. So I thought I would share a slide, which I did share last year, but I do think it's still relevant in the context of those continued declines. And it's really about just broadening the view of what volunteering looks like within your organisation. Do you have a wide range of volunteer models? How flexible are you with your volunteers? How creative are you with getting volunteers involved? Some of the big national charities, the likes of the Samaritans or the British Heart Foundation, have made some really significant changes to how volunteers can get involved. So they've got ad hoc, you can drop in for an hour and do a Samaritans helpline session, rather than doing these very structured and rigorous sessions and trainings, and the same with working in charity shops. So how flexible and creative are you being with the involvement of your volunteers, and are you able to shift to more informal volunteering to match that trend in the reduction in formal volunteering and the shift to more informal, so people are more able to fit that informal volunteering time around their other commitments, whether it's now a second job or helping out with childcare or whatever it might be, which might mean that formal volunteering is now more of a struggle or a challenge for them to commit to. Do you have both short and longer term volunteering opportunities? And do you engage with your volunteers digitally as well? I mean, essentially hybrid working, we've all talked about, is here to stay. But are you using digital platforms to engage with your volunteers? And I think although there are clearly some real challenges around volunteering in the sector at the moment, there's also, I think, the opportunity, particularly through the use of digital, to perhaps engage with a broader volunteer workforce and more diverse volunteer workforce. So I think there are real opportunities there as well. And I'll share this slide just very quickly. So we will circulate the slides around afterwards. They have links on them, so hyperlinks, so you can just click on the slides. It will take you to these resources. So the NCVO does have a great resource, which is around involving volunteers, and it has some great ideas and suggestions in there as well. So we'll send that around because it's got some useful links, I think, for those of you who do have volunteers working within your organisations. And I think just to touch on the people aspect of it as well then. So obviously staff within charities have really been at the front line of dealing with some of these challenges and increases in demand in recent years. And the statistics are showing that 31% of staff are therefore now either working additional hours or during their holiday to try and meet with these demands and challenges. And I know many organisations, many charities are facing challenges around recruitment at the moment of staff, as well as involvement of volunteers. So what are charities doing to meet some of those challenges? Well, 86% of charities are now reporting to have much more flexible working, which I think is a really positive thing. And 60% of charities have introduced mental health support and well-being for their staff and for their volunteers. And I think for me this is a really critical point actually at the moment, because a lot of staff volunteers are facing burnout. I know certainly as an employer myself, we've really strengthened our mental health provision and offering to staff over the last 12 to 24 months, because I think it's really, really important. So as a charity or as an organisation, if that's not something you've considered for your workforce and your volunteers at the moment, I do think it's very, very relevant in the current climate to be doing so. And I know there are some great examples of charities here in the room that have done that today, so if you want me to introduce you to any of them, I'm very happy to do that. There's a lot of other measures that have been introduced, like formal recognition, financial well-being awareness, so on and so forth. But I think it is really a good time to reflect on staff and what you're able to offer your staff and support to them during this time as well. And of course, it wouldn't be relevant to touch on the wider sector without talking very briefly about energy costs. I know there's been lots of, again, surveys done about the impact that this has had on charities, but I thought I'd just share some statistics around what charities have been doing to deal with some of those challenges, which made for quite interesting reading. Many of them are turning the thermostat down, which is, yeah, I won't say anymore. I'm not good with the cold. But more concerningly, I think 1 in 5 had reduced their premises use, and 1 in 10 had reduced their hours of operation. So it's quite sad, really, actually, to see that those energy costs are having a real direct impact on the ability of charities to provide services. And of course, in the context of those income challenges that we talked about earlier over the last few years, and the fact that that financial resilience of many charities has been eroded during that time, I think many charities are now struggling with some of these costs as they continue because their financial resilience has been spent, essentially. And many charities I know are now using essentially reserves to cover some of these operating costs whilst they're hoping that that income returns to pre-pandemic levels. So again, there is some guidance which you may find useful from a charity perspective from the NCVO around cost of living and various grants and funding that's available. So again, there's a link on those for the slides when we circulate those around. So I think in closing then, in terms of setting the scene, the economy overall is seeing a gradual improvement. That is for sure. We're not where we were last year. But it really will take some time for that improvement to have an impact or a direct impact on the lives of charity beneficiaries. That's not going to flow through for a little time yet. And so many charities are still seeing that upward trajectory in demand for their services and support, and it's becoming increasingly important. But for many charities, again, that is in the context of those sustained financial challenges that we've just talked about. And so resourcing and servicing that demand continues to come with many challenges for many charities, particularly around staff and volunteers. And there is a bit of a question as to whether there's a tale of two sectors here as well, to a degree, that the smaller charities that are more reliant on volunteers, perhaps have less financial resilience, are finding it a lot harder than some of the larger organisations to adapt. But I think that's really important because actually 80% of the charities in England and Wales are smaller charities, to give you some context. So it is really important that we're supporting them with some of these challenges as well. So I just wanted to close by reflecting on, given all of those things that we've talked about in terms of setting the scene, my question would therefore actually just be, is there a need for change? And with any crisis or with any change, it effectively always drives a need for change, either at an organisation level or at a people level. So as leaders of your charities, have you reflected, can you continue to deliver what you've always delivered in the context of what we've just been talking about? Can you continue to make decisions in the same way that you've always made decisions? Or is there a risk that in doing so, you either become less relevant or less impactful because of these broader changes that are going on? And there is a really good read, and again, this will be linked in the slides that we sent around, but New Philanthropy Capital have issued a report. It's called Being a Trustee in an Age of Perma-Crisis, and they've actually gone around and surveyed a number of trustees and charity leaders and talked to them about what they've been doing in the current environment to ensure that they're adapting and their organisation is continuing to be effective and impactful. And I touched just briefly on some of the points that they raised because they are quite interesting. One of the main points they said was around keeping focused on what the mission of your charity is. So the feedback was it is tempting to enter survival mode at the moment to protect your organisation or to protect particular programmes. But actually, this is a crisis for your beneficiaries. And it's easy to forget that, actually, and think about it being a crisis for your organisation. But your organisation is here to serve those beneficiaries. It is first and foremost and primarily a crisis for them. So making sure that they remain your focus and you're absolutely clear on that mission is really important, I think, and having that mission mindset rather than a preservation mindset can be really beneficial. Being open to change. The report said gone are the days of a 5-year plan, or crikey, a 5-year plan at the moment. You'd have to incorporate so much into it. But actually just being open to change and being flexible as to how those goals are achieved and how your services are delivered, and have that change mindset. One of the feedback points was there is no point holding out for business as usual. And I think that's quite interesting. There can be a temptation to do that, I think, but we're a long way away from that at the moment. So making sure you're drawing in the right input and support to those changes, but also to make sure you are still looking beyond that immediate focus, to understand how your organisation sits within the wider ecosystem. And I know I was talking about that with some of the participants here today, but making sure that what you're doing works with others to deliver your strategy as well. And I think that's a really key important point for the sector at the moment. So that concludes my slides. I hope that was useful just to set the scene a little bit for some of the broader challenges in the sector at the moment. And I will hand over to Sarah, who will touch on some good financial management in those challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. That was a really interesting update on the sector. And leading on from that, so I'm going to look at some good financial management tools that, given the highlighted issues that have been mentioned, are more important than ever to be considering using at the moment. So it's never too late to start or to improve how you're monitoring your organisation's financial performance. And I'm just going to run through, first of all, some of the key tools that you might want to, well, you might already be using or you might want to consider start using within your organisation. So lots of these you'll know already, and I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a minute. So we have budgets and cash flow forecasting, your internal controls and policies in relation to your finance, how you communicate information to your board and over what time period. So do you produce a monthly accounting pack, quarterly, or is it longer than that they take to see financial information? What does your risk register look like? Do you include within your risk register financial risks? So these could be investment risks, this could be key finance personnel, other issues such as those. And what does your business plan look like? Obviously, as Lexi just mentioned, 5-year plans don't necessarily work. But when did you last look at your business plan? You might have a 5-year plan, but are you continually looking at that and updating it and considering if it's still relevant? What finance skills do you have on your board or within your senior management team? And if you have got gaps, what are you looking to do about those? Are you looking to fill those gaps through training, or are you actively recruiting to fill in, to bring those skills in? And then looking at your reserves policy, what does your reserves policy look like? Is it tailored to the specific needs of your organisation, or is it a flat, or we're going to take 6 months of expenditure because that's what other organisations do? And lastly, I'm going to go through some financial ratios with you of different tools that you might want to consider using. Ultimately, in order to survive, you need to be, cash is probably the most important thing to be thinking about. You need to make sure that your cash is available to meet the obligations as and when they fall due, because timing is everything. So, and being aware, if there is a gap, what's that gap and what are you going to do to close it? So I'm often asked, what's the difference between a budget and a forecast? So a budget is an estimate of your income and expenditure, usually over a defined period of time, potentially over an accounting period or 12 months. And so with this, you use all your accounting adjustments and you would forecast whether or not you're going to have a surplus, deficit or break-even position. In contrast, your forecast, a cash flow forecast, just looks at those cash movements. It excludes all of those accounting adjustments such as prepayments and accruals. It doesn't account for deferred income, which obviously in the charity sector quite often there's not matching between the grant income and the expenditure. And ultimately, it tracks the timing of your cash movements. And the thing to be aware of, even if you are budgeting a surplus for a financial period, it doesn't necessarily mean that during that period you're going to have the cash to meet obligations as they fall due. So I've got a little example here to show you. So this is completely made up, not based on anything. So whether or not this is an effective charity is a different matter. But the first column, we have the budget. And so in accounting terms, the budget for the year is 89,500 surplus. So everything should be good. Then the other columns, January to December, are the cash flow movements in that period of time. And you will see at 2 points during that year, the cash balance goes negative. So in the 12-month period, great, we're going to get a surplus. But at 2 points, we need an overdraft. So you need to be, it's about being aware of this situation, being aware of when the pinch points are and timing. Because if this organisation's got an overdraft, great, it can service those liabilities and obligations as needed. But if it doesn't, it needs to know what to do about that. So the first thing I'd consider is looking at your costs, which ones are fixed and which ones are flexible. So things like staff costs, they are fixed costs. You need to pay those every month. There's nothing you can do about that. But other costs potentially could be a bit more flexible. So in this example, we've got here, we have fundraising costs in there. So in January, there's £8,000 of fundraising costs. And let's say this is for the event that takes place in May. In between that period is when the cash goes overdrawn. So that would be a consideration is, do you need to be making that expenditure as early, or is there an option to move it? So I've updated that. So I'm going to highlight and just show what I've changed here. So after assessing fixed and flexible costs, you can see the bottom line is there's no red anymore. So we're not going into an overdraft. And what I've changed here, if we can see the fundraising costs where we had £8,000 in January, it's been moved and split into 2 tranches. So this would involve looking at your suppliers, talking to your suppliers about whether or not you can delay the payment, whether it's feasible to have the work done later. In addition, if I didn't mention it on the previous slide, is within your forecast, in cash flow forecast, we have a fixed asset addition. So a fixed asset addition doesn't necessarily appear in your budget because it doesn't affect your surplus if it's a capital asset, but it does affect your cash. So again, that's the £5,000, and that one there, I think we had it in July in the previous slide, and that's just been delayed. So let's say this IT infrastructure update, which was something that needed to be done, but it could be delayed. So with the budget alone, the organisation, it wouldn't know that it's going to have the issues with cash levels until it was happening. But by having the forecast and spreading their costs, it allows management to be able to plan ahead and assess any of those pinch points as they arise. So some little tips about what makes good budget forecasts. First of all, your budget needs to be for a minimum of 12 months. Not for a minimum of 12 months from your previous accounting period, a minimum of 12 months from today at all times. So whenever we're completing your audit or your independent examination, this is something we're always asking for. We're always asking for your budgets, and we're wanting 12 months because as part of the required going concern review, we have to review from 12 months from the period, from the date that the accounts are formally approved. So if that's part of your general practice to always have 12 months, it'll make your life easier for when you're finalising your accounts, but actually it's also good practice as well. With your cash flow forecast, I'd recommend it's a 12-month rolling forecast. So with a rolling forecast, that means that you would be updating the cash balance for your actual cash at the end of each month. So it arises because sometimes your grant income might come in later than anticipated, projects are delayed, so it may well change. The other thing to consider is inflation. is making sure you build in inflation into those budgets and forecasts. So had you created a budget a year ago and not included inflation and based it on your previous year's costs, you probably aren't going to be anywhere near achieving that budget. And make sure you're honest with your in your budget, because it doesn't help anybody it doesn't help if you are over ambitious about what you're going to achieve. You need to be honest to be aware of any issues as they might arise. So you'll be needing to make assumptions, but it's vital that you record those assumptions. So what level of inflation have you estimated? How have you calculated the estimated donations that are going to be received? Because when you're then looking at comparing your actuals against your budget, you'll know where you base those figures in the first instance. So you'll be able to consider whether those would be appropriate assumptions to use in future periods, or whether actually you need to address those going forward to improve them. By comparing, at the end of a period, comparing your budgets to your actual results allows you to assess how accurate your budgeting skills are, which means that, so the more accurate a budget is in the previous year, it gives you more confidence in placing reliance on your own future budgets. And where you do have a budget or a forecast, have you considered doing scenario planning to stress test those figures? So especially at the moment with government funding cuts, so potentially you could lose an income stream. You could do scenario A and scenario B. So you do your budget or your forecast as it is, as you're expecting the income, but what happens if you lose an income stream? What would your organisation look like? Is it still sustainable? And so for you to continue, or would you need to be looking at other sources of income? Obviously, you can't bring in anticipate unforeseen events, but you need to keep in mind that you need to be keeping a buffer to make sure that you have the available funds there if needed. Key is, any budget or forecast that you have, it needs to be simple. It's for the use of the management and for use of the trustees. And the most important thing is they can understand it. So an overly complex budget may not be understandable. Often I see people where there's been changes in finance teams or in treasurers, that you inherit a budget or a forecast. If you don't understand how it's made up or where those figures come from, sometimes it's easier to start again, start from scratch, make it very simple and build it up as time goes on. It's more important to have a budget or a forecast that you can understand and use than to have one that's all singing or dancing with all these fancy links. So next, I'm going to talk about some financial ratios, which can be used as quick measurement tools to sort of assess financial performance in certain areas of your organisation. So they can use to identify trends, either year on year, month on month, or against other similar organisations. So you could set yourselves target ranges of where you want to be within these. And when I run through these, remember they're for internal use, so they're just for you to use as management within your charity. You don't need to share them with anybody, but they're very useful to track financial health. So the most important thing is this can help early identification of any issues that could arise, which means that you're able to put plans in place to move on. So the first ratio I'm going to look at is fundraising efficiency. So it's also known as your fundraising multiplier, and this is calculated by looking at your fundraising revenue in a period divided by your fundraising expenditure. So, for example, you may raise £120,000 in fundraising revenue and your fundraising expenditure was £30,000, so your fundraising multiplier is 4. You have generated 4 times more income than you've invested in your fundraising. So this is known as the return on the investment. So the higher the number above 1, the more successful your fundraising. If the number's below 1, then obviously it's costing you more to fundraise than you're actually generating. And this can be done either across the whole organisation or on an event-by-event basis. So you can consider how successful your all different income streams are. it's also important to consider the wider context when looking at this, because some events may not be as profitable in terms of fundraising, but actually they may well have outreach to potential beneficiaries. You may be also generating volunteers or awareness about your organisation. So it's just looking at each of these events in context. The next ratio is your surplus, or as a commercial organisation, we'll call this your profit margin. So this is looking at your net income or your surplus for the year as a percentage of the total income generated. So, for example, £60,000 surplus in the year with a 700,000 total income means that your surplus margin is 8.75%. So obviously, if you're making a surplus, it's a good thing, you're making a contribution to your charity's reserves, but it's about being able to compare year on year those trends. Because let's say you then make 100,000 in the following year, and everyone's like, oh great, we've made more, it's a bigger surplus, we're investing our reserves. But if your income is 1.5 million, your efficiency, your surplus margin has fallen, as it's only at 6.67. So it's being able to, it allows you to compare different periods where the income's at a different level. Obviously, as a charity, creating a surplus isn't what you're there for. It's creating that public benefit and sustaining your mission. So you will obviously not be looking at this in the same way as a commercial organisation. And it's also worth remembering, in some years you will be budgeting to have a deficit because of the nature of grant funding, and that sometimes that grant funding comes in and is recognised as income in one year, but your project isn't carried out until the following year. So it's just being aware of those different situations. You could also use this by activity, so look at how profitable a certain activity is. So you may well have more commercial activities within your organisations which are there to generate income more so than public benefits. So you can look and see so you can assess how the contribution to your reserves is being created by those. Another interesting ratio is looking at your earned income. So this compares your earned income, which would include, say, trading income, income from events, investments, performance-related grants, and service-level agreements. So your earned income are the things that you have more control over because you're doing something to generate that income, compared to your unearned income, which is donations and grants with no conditions attached to them. So obviously at the moment it's really important to have a diversified earned income to make sure that if one income stream falls, that you have got other opportunities there. So this is calculated by taking that earned income divided by as a ratio against your unearned income. So for example here, 90,000 of earned income and 360,000 of unearned income gives you a ratio of 0.25 to 1. So you're only getting a quarter of earned income compared to unearned income. Depending on your charity's activities will depend upon what level you want this to be. This is something you could look at other organisations who have similar activities to consider, or to consider benchmarking yourselves to see whether your model is as sustainable as theirs. So another interesting thing to look at is the project expense ratio. So this looks at, this really is looking at what percentage of your costs is being spent directly on your charitable activity, so reaching those beneficiaries. So individual donors like this to be a really high figure because they don't always appreciate that it costs a lot to maintain and run the infrastructure of a charity. So what this can show, though, is it shows how efficient you are in fulfilling your mission. So it takes your total project costs as a percentage of your expenditure as a whole. Things to keep in mind when looking at this is if you do have a very high number, yes, you are going to look attractive to individual donors because your beneficiaries are receiving the money. However, are you investing enough in your infrastructure to make sure that you are a sustainable organisation ongoing? And obviously, as I mentioned, if this is a low ratio, you're deterring individual donors. this is, again, something that you could probably look at taking from similar organisations' accounts, because looking at their statutory accounts, you can see their charitable activity expenditure, and so you'll be able to compare yourselves to benchmark against them. So moving on to this and on from this and looking, continuing to look at project costs, it's useful to be aware of what your unit cost and your full cost recovery cost is of a project. So when you're accepting performance-related grants where you're expected to deliver a certain amount of service, it's being aware of what that cost is to your organisation. So I've got a little example. So in this example, the project that you're running, needs employees' time, which is going to cost £15,000, and materials of £3,000. So the total direct cost of this project is £18,000. We're going to say this is going to take those employees' time accounts for 600 hours, and it's going to benefit 100 beneficiaries. So really, basically, you're looking at that and you'll be like, oh, okay, great, £180 per beneficiary, and that covers the cost of that project. That covers the cost of the project, but it doesn't cover the cost of running the project, because obviously your organisation has its overheads as well. So if you've got your indirect costs, your overheads of your organisation, let's say they're £40,000, we need to look at how much of that actually is attributable to this specific project. So to do that, we look at how many, in this case we're using hours, you could use something else, you could use floor space, it depends how the organisation works. But if we say there's 2,400 hours of delivery time across the whole organisation, and 600 hours related to the project we're pricing, that's 25% of the hours, so it would be a reasonable assumption to take 25% of those overheads. That would then give you a total cost for your project of £28,000. So that is a £280 cost per beneficiary. So it's being aware of that when you're pricing these contracts or when you're accepting them. You're not always going to be able to charge the full £280 per beneficiary to cover the whole amount of your overheads, but it's really important to understand what the cost it does need to be, because you'll need to be looking at how you're going to fill that gap, how you're going to fund it. Are you able to raise some other income to cover those costs? So. And also keep in mind, so this is with 100 beneficiaries. If you were to actually underachieve and not manage to supply to 100 beneficiaries and your income reduces because of that, that actually means that your cost would increase because per unit actually increases. But similarly, if you are able to deliver to a higher number, which means that the income becomes higher, then your cost would reduce per unit. And so obviously it's just to keep in mind that fluid movement. So another ratio, so this one is more to do with cash position, which you might want to use, is your current ratio. So this looks at your current assets on your balance sheet compared to your current liabilities. So your current assets are made up of things like your bank account, debtors, and stock. And your current liabilities are your creditors, so any suppliers, PAYE liabilities, and short-term loan payments and things like that. So, for example, if you had 500,000 of current assets and 350,000 of current liabilities, you have a current ratio of 1.42. So, if you had exactly the same assets and liabilities, your current ratio would be 1. So, looking at this, anything, if you're at 1 or below 1, this causes concern because you haven't got enough assets to pay for your liabilities. What you need to consider is what makes up those assets, though. So if your assets are made up of stock, then that isn't readily convertible to cash. So actually, you would want a higher ratio, and also how quickly do your debtors pay. If it's all cash, then that is cash that is available to pay those liabilities. It's useful to compare this margin, like period on period, either year on year or quarterly, monthly, because if this ratio is going up, it shows that you are increasing your margin of safety, that you're increasing the proportion of assets you have to pay any obligations as they fall due. But if this ratio is falling, you need to start questioning your ability to meet your commitments in future periods, and whether or not in the future it's going to cause you any issues. I did that bit. And remember with this is if you have any restricted funds, your restricted cash obviously is restricted to the project you're working on, so it should be looked at separately and not included in the main current ratio. So the last ratio I'm going to talk about is free reserves. This is something I always seem to talk about. So your free reserves, I'm sure you know, is you take your total funds and less any restricted funds and less any fixed assets, which are classed as unrestricted, and less any designated or endowment funds, and that gives you your free reserves of your organisation. So when thinking about your free reserves, there's several bits you need to consider. First of all, you should have a policy of what is sufficient for your charity's needs. As I mentioned before, it's about your charity. How much money do you need? Do you need 3 months, 6 months? Does that work for you? If you've got lots of projects and a high level of staff and there's a risk that a project might be closing down, do you also need to include any close down costs, things like redundancies if a project could end, and things like that within those free reserves policy? And what are you basing these figures on? So if you're basing it on expenditure, are you basing it on last year's expenditure or your budgeted expenditure? If you're basing it on last year's expenditure, do you need to increase your policy for inflation? And then it's also really important to regularly review your actual reserves against your policy. So obviously we always do this as part of the annual accounts, and it's disclosed within your trustees report what your actual free reserves position is and whether you've met your policy. But it's good practice to look at this throughout the year rather than just looking at it once a year, so that you know your position partway through the year and whether or not you need to be doing some work to consider what can be improved. So I know that there were a lot of numbers in that and a lot of calculations. So they're all obviously all on the slides and they will be circulated to you. And now I'm going to pass you over to Olivia. Sorry, not Olivia, it's going to be Laurie. Laurie's doing this one. So I'm going to pass you over to Laurie from Stephen Gaines Solicitors to talk about charity culture and governance challenges. Okay. Thank you.
examples of charity culture wars. Is that easy?
Yeah, I'm just gonna just.
Yeah. Sorry. Not a natural Britney Spears, obviously. Lord. Up here? Or just carry on as usual? Okay. Anyone hear me? No? That's okay. Okay? Yeah, I think we're back on. Lovely. So there's been lots about the charity culture wars in the press. You may have seen it. And this is all about being aware that charities have been criticised quite openly about engaging in any form of political discussion, with former chair of the Charity Commission, Baroness Stoll, saying that basically charities and politics don't mix. You know, stay away or risk losing your charitable status. And for many of you, I'm sure you'll understand that the dynamics, as we've just heard from Lexi, the geopolitical consequences, the national economy, the impact on the vulnerable people that within the communities that you serve. You know, politics plays a role in what you're doing, and civil society and politics have, for many, many years, been, you know, hand in hand. And what we've seen is that the new chair of the Charity Commission, Orlando Fraser, has confirmed, he's a lawyer, he likes the law, as Olivia and I do, and he said actually we need to reset that dial. We need to be able as charities to talk about a political dialogue, to talk about the impact that's happening in the communities and for our beneficiaries. But what we've seen on the back of that is that charities have been coming under increased scrutiny. So we've seen the chief exec of Oxfam, he's been hauled over the coals in the national press for spending money on a new inclusivity toolkit, effectively, a language guide, so that his staff and his volunteers can talk to beneficiaries in a way that's appropriate. So they were talking about things like migration, about gender, about race, and about disability. But the right-wing press grabbed hold of that, and it was another criticism for Oxfam after the aftermath of what we've already seen around safeguarding. And we've also seen that for institutions like the National Trust. And over the last 10 to 15 years, you know, statues that were previously historical artifacts, probably very much unremarked in our culture, people walked by, have suddenly taken on a new meaning. They mean something, and what's their history? Who should be telling that history? Because now that really does matter. So you will know, then you'll have seen that the National Trust, with their interim report on colonialism and the effect of slavery, really unleashed a storm within the sector. And how that dialogue has played out for trustees is really very interesting, because not only has it been in the press, but it's been played out by the trustees on their trustee board, looking at how that trustee board will be made up. And there's a right-wing Restore Trust group who are looking to influence the council, challenging a woke agenda, and indicating that the charity should get back really to its roots, which are about managing the countryside and our heritage. So it's interesting then that in the wake of that culture war, and many of you will have heard this phrase, actually the National Trust popularity has risen. Interesting. Not always as you would read. And similarly, the RNLI has also this year been in the news with the migrant crisis, being alleged to be a taxi, rescuing people from boats, with people like Nigel Farage saying that they should really just focus on what they're doing and not undertake this humanitarian work. But the RNLI again have stepped back and said, actually, this is part of our legal and moral duty to our beneficiaries, for anyone at sea and in need. So, as charity leaders, we need to be aware of the culture wars. We need to be aware that they divide the sector. And it's likely, as we've just heard, that leading up to the general election, there's going to be more interest nationally and locally in how you are positioning yourselves. And the NCVO's chief exec, Sarah Vibert, indicated that it's a challenging environment, particularly for charities that are campaigning on some more controversial rights, such as trans rights. But it's not actually as divided as I think they would lead you to believe. Actually, the public views around charities and the trust in charities continues to grow. And we've heard this morning the valuable work that all of you in the room do and across the nation, particularly relying on trustees in order to deliver that work. So just wanted to point out the campaigning and political activity guidance that you should be aware of leading up to the general election, just so that if you are engaging in any form of local activity or even national activity, you know where the lines should be drawn. And if you aren't familiar with the guidance, please do review it. In summary, it's about trust boards understanding how you keep within the law, how you are respectful and tolerant, but it's also about understanding that you can be political, but with a small, not a big P. Okay, so I was asked to talk a little bit about issues that we're seeing, and Olivia and I work with lots of charities across the Southwest, but also nationally, and we were reflecting on what we're seeing, which may resonate, I hope, with some of you in the room. I think generally as charity lawyers, we were all commenting that we're seeing more complicated disputes, particularly between members of staff, but also between trustees, often staff and trustees, which is even more challenging. And we're seeing that these can't be really addressed through traditional grievance procedures. We're seeing that it's taking longer to get these issues resolved. And previously they tended to be what I would consider quite discrete issues around a particular issue or a particular policy someone has or they haven't done something. Now there are more nebulous concepts, and this is reflected really through the start of what I've been talking about this morning about the culture wars, because people are raising issues now about the culture of an organisation, about how they feel at work. These are not easy things to describe in a grievance process, and they often involve a number of different members of staff and trustees, often with no codes of conduct for trustees in place, often with allegations made, particularly with trustees, but there's no awareness of how those will be treated or managed by the trustees that are involved. And we've seen this year Oxford University come under particular criticism. They managed to rack up 6.6 million in legal fees, not with us, I must say, but also with PR companies as well. And that started off as a fairly benign issue with the dean asking for a salary increase, and it turned into a heated dispute involving the Charity Commission. And I think around £5 million worth of fees were agreed after they'd been incurred by trustees. So some of these things spiral out of control. And we also saw cats protection. So the cats were brought into this as well. There were 18 cats living in the chair's house. So I've got 2. I'm not sure my husband would go for 16 more. But that was felt by the interim CEO to be inappropriate and to raise concerns regarding welfare. He stepped down, so did the chair. Again, that comes back to, are we living and breathing the values? How aligned are our people with the values and organisational purposes that we are representing? I also mentioned the RNLI just a few minutes ago. Also with the RNLI, once you're in a storm, it seems to attract a few more, unfortunately. And they also got dragged in on what started off as an incident at a lifeboat station involving a sexist comment. It turned into a full-blown inquiry around sexism and misogyny within the RNLI as an organisation. So you can see quite quickly how toxic cultures can get sort of inflamed, and for that quickly to become far more widespread than the original issue that prompted it. And it's clear that these issues are much wider and deeper, and they're really time-consuming for anyone that's been involved in any high-profile HR issues within their organisation, particularly when those are involving senior members of the team, and very difficult to resolve legally and reputationally. Which leads us on to why. Why now? Why are we as a sector experiencing more of these issues? And there's a few things I just wanted to raise quickly. I think the first thing is around generational perspectives. I think we've got something like 4 or 5 generations working within workplaces at the moment, which is the broadest spread of any time in our history. And those generational differences have seen that management styles that were previously acceptable within organisations are somewhat out of date or felt out of date with some staff. And also, certainly younger people, we talk about millennials or Generation Z, but they're certainly more switched on to values and culture. And they place a huge amount of expectation on those within the workplace. And I think as charities, you are purpose-led organisations. And in that context, people are more vigilant and expect more of you when they work for you probably than they would if they were working for a private sector organisation. So I think we're seeing more queries and questions raised in the charity sector simply because of the nature of what you do and who you are. So what can you do and what the costs are? Well, just heard 6.6 million in legal costs, which you clearly would want to avoid. But reputationally, particularly, you'd want to avoid those too. And organisational culture is set from the top. So as trustees, owning that culture and living that culture, not only in what you write, but what you do. And that may mean you need to have improved training at all levels and ensure that you're clear about how issues are managed. And that's sometimes through your policies and procedures, or should always be, but sometimes not, but particularly whistleblowing and serious incident reporting. And it's important that you stay in touch with how your staff are feeling. And if there's a little issue that you think, maybe we'll overlook that, just take a moment and stop, because sometimes that's the moment where you could actually take an intervention to avoid something that's much more challenging. Olivia and I in the last year, we've probably dealt with 5 or 6 very complicated matters of this type, and actually trying just to manage the costs associated with that takes a lot of energy and effort from trustees who we've heard are working already with significant budget challenges. And just to reiterate finally the point that Lexi actually made about well-being and culture, they're so important right now as people are under increasing strain. And so ensuring that your staff don't consider that you have an outward-facing persona and an inward-facing one, trying to be as consistent as you can with all your messaging is really key. And messaging leads me briefly onto social media. Can I just ask which charities here do use social media? Do you have social media accounts? Yeah, most do. It's clearly the time when you need to think about your messaging on your statements, and it links directly to what I've just said. On the slide in a moment, we'll see an example of where it went wrong. But it's a really complicated world of communication, but the opportunities for you to use social media in the context of the challenges that we've already touched on this morning are huge. The Global Trends report on giving indicated that 29% of people on social media feel most inspired to give. So that's how their giving is inspired. And 71% of non-profits see social media as an effective tool for fundraising. A staggering 4.7 billion people have a social media account. Olivia and I over breakfast were trying to work out how many people there roughly are in the world. It's about 7.8 billion. So a huge proportion are on social media. And the viral nature of social media means it's a game changer for charities. Many of you will remember the Ice Bucket Challenge back in 2014. Can't believe it's quite that long. People throwing cold water buckets all over each other. That created this, huge fundraising effort of $115 million were raised. So you can really see the power of that and the ways that you can use it for accountability with one charity, Charity Water, looking at using their GPS coordinates to link projects to where things are happening so that in real time people can see the impact of fundraising on projects that they're interested in. So it's all very positive about how you can use it, but understandably there are some challenges, and this is where the Commission's guidance has just come in. Some of you may have seen it. You may have seen the consultation that came out in January. It was quite widely criticised because it required you to mine each other's personal accounts, have a look at what I was writing, what others were writing, criticise and hold each other to account. And And it was very difficult to implement, and there was lots and lots of responses. But it's a good example of how the Commission have actually worked with the charity sector to actually improve how that's come to bear in the final guidance. And the guidance itself is very, very useful. I'd encourage everyone, we'll send a link around to take a look if you haven't already. But it's about appreciating the opportunity and managing the risk. So having that on your risk, just as Sarah's already mentioned, your risk register, having your financial and accounting risks, important that you flag up some of these too. As very recently, we were approached by a charity who'd lost complete control of their social media account. The genius that had been using it had disappeared, had left somewhat rapidly from the organisation, and they were lost in limbo with Facebook. They couldn't find it. If you've ever tried to speak to anyone at Facebook, if you've had your account suspended, good luck. There's no one there. They don't exist. So we had to fight really hard to try and get those administration rights reinstated for them. So brief summary of the guidance is it tells you how you can use it, but also how you manage it. And that's partly because it's fast-paced, and also because removing or editing, taking down content is really difficult. And if anyone has seen how quickly things spiral on social media, by the time you found out, it's almost too late. And that goes both, if you're a large charity or you're a very small charity, things get shared, liked, commented on, and quite quickly you can find yourself in a situation where you're certainly on the back foot. So these are my top tips, just to kind of finish up. Do you as a charity know how you're using your social media? Do you have a strategy for how you're using it? I ask that question. Quite often I get a little blank response. So if you're in that boat, don't panic. And likewise, do you have a social media policy? That's one of the steps that the guidance recommends that you do. If you don't have one, come and see Olivia and I over coffee or a bit later over lunch, and we can have a chat with you about potentially how we could help. And how do you manage your risks around sharing content? Do you, if you're a trustee, know how you're sharing content? You'll see there on the screen the Liars media post from the RSPB. They took quite a direct approach, I think you would say, to criticising the environmental policy of Rishi and co. And that led to Commission involvement, as you can imagine, because it was attacking people, not policies. So policies are good ground for charities if you wish to make a statement. People are not. And the chief exec of the charity had to come out and make a formal apology. Not only that, but one of their trustees also stepped out and said, I'm not happy about this either. So it became an internal and an external media storm. Do you use social media to fundraise? If so, are you clear about how you're using it, how it's linked to your bank accounts, who has access to those accounts and that information? And have you all had some social media training? If not, I recommend you do for the future. The world of cybersecurity is way beyond my experience. All I know is that if that's not on your risk register, it should be. And how you're taking steps to stay safe online is, and also another point that you should be picking up in your social media policies. And how does that link to how you deal with serious incidents if you do find yourself in a media storm? Are you familiar with the process, and do you have a serious incident reporting policy? If you don't, again, don't panic. Come and see Olivia and I over coffee, and we can see how we can help you with that one too. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Super. There we go. Super. Thank you very much, Laurie. That was really, really interesting and lots of things to think about there. So now, please note, it's time for coffee break. So we're going to have a 20-minute break. So there'll be a timer on screen for those of you at home. But otherwise, yeah, go and grab yourself a coffee. tweet it when I talk, and then I'll do a LinkedIn Facebook. Yeah, super. Fantastic. I haven't got the clicker. Lexi, could you pass me the clicker? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. If we can start again. Okay. Okay, so welcome back. We're going to pick up now with a technical update. And so I'm going to cover some Charity Commission guidance updates and some tax and VAT. So if we start with Charity Commission guidance, so the majority of the guidance that's available on the Charity Commission website has now been updated for changes from the Charities Act 2022. Olivia is going to speak about that in a bit more detail shortly. In addition, CC8 internal financial controls and CC14 investing charity money have both been completely redesigned. So I'm just going to go through some of those changes in a moment. And if you're interested, there's this little quiz that's now available on the Charity Commission website, which is designed to test trustees' knowledge. So it only takes 5 minutes to do. It's got 10 scenario questions, so of what would you do in certain situations. And so it's interesting to use it to just test your own knowledge and to see whether you'd be right in those situations. So that is linked in on the slides, which I'll be sending round. It is anonymous, yes, it's just for your own use. So if we look at CCA and internal financial controls, so this guidance was issued in April of this year, and it is completely redesigned from the previous version. So the key changes are there's now more detail about fraud and cybercrime. There's information now in there about digital payment systems, and corruption and bribery are now identified as specific operational risks that need to be considered. There's a lot more detail about internal audit and how that might be able to help with your organisation. And there's a redesigned controls checklist, which again I've linked into the slides. This is a useful tool that you can use to assess, firstly, what controls you have in your organisation and how they compare to the guidance, or what controls might be missing. So the new guidance is broken down into sections, which actually does make it a lot easier to use, so you can dip in and out of the sections that are relevant for you. So it covers banking, income, expenditure, payments to related parties, assets and investments, and loans. And hospitality, and including gifts. So just as a reminder, so who is responsible for your internal financial controls? So the guidance clearly states that you can delegate this work, the detailed work, to either management or to one particular trustee. But you need to keep in mind that even if you're not the one who's been delegated the detailed work, all trustees remain equally responsible for ensuring that your financial controls are, one, designed correctly and monitored. So as a recap, regardless of your size, all charities should have internal financial controls. What those look like will depend upon the size of your organisation, the activities that you are carrying out, and the areas in which you operate. So if you're a larger charity is going to obviously have a substantial larger number of financial controls where you've got a finance team who have access to bank accounts and things, or if you are working with overseas organisations where you need to be monitoring to make sure that those monies are reaching the correct destination. So your financial controls need to cover all of the aspects of how your charity handles its resources. You need to cover GDPR and how you're dealing with personal information. So as I said, it covers the size, depends upon your size and activities. You need to make sure that you have relevant training on those financial controls. And so you need to be training the trustees, your staff, and your volunteers in your internal financial controls. That training needs to include how any suspected abuse or any concerns can be raised. And with that, there needs to be a mechanism where those concerns can be raised directly to the trustees if necessary. And there needs to be no way that anybody in the organisation can override those controls, be that the management or the trustees. And by making sure there's no capacity for overriding controls, actually gives management and trustees more protection themselves, because it reduces any doubt over their actions. So the internal financial controls should be regularly reviewed. That is the controls that you actually have in place and monitoring of those controls to make sure that they are being carried out as they should. So some of the key new things within the guidance. So firstly is online banking. It specifically states within the new guidance that dual authorisation is required for online banking for charities. So this is where one person goes on and designs the payment, and the second person, a different person, goes on to approve it before the payment is made. Now, the Charity Commission has recognised that this is a major issue for charities because banks don't really support this. So recently, the Chief Executive of the Charity Commission for England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland together wrote an open letter to the UK, all of the UK banking institutions, to highlight the issues that charities have and that they are unable to meet the required financial controls. So the issues that they have highlighted to the banks are about accounts being closed for long periods, the fact that there's a reduction in the banking services, so that there's no longer bank branches or bank managers, there's even poor customer service, administrative delays, and basically online banking does not match the way that charities operate. So hopefully, I think this was last month that this letter was issued, so hopefully this will help the banks to realise what they need to do to help improve the banking system for charities. They also, within this letter, highlighted some of the things that charities have ended up having to do, which aren't best practice, as a result of this. So, I've seen this where charities have large unsecured cash reserves sitting in one financial institution, which is then in excess of the financial services protection levels because they can't open another account where they'd be able to access those funds. Also, I've seen this as well, where trustees have been forced, especially during COVID, where online banking payments were necessary. They were forced to use their own bank accounts to make payments and then reclaim the money after. And obviously, this is not best practice for the charity, but it was required in order to continue operating. So another new area, which wasn't touched on in the previous guidance, is crypto assets. So crypto assets are cryptocurrencies and NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens. So these are digital representations of value or rights that use blockchain technology. So the new guidance highlights that before you accept, this might not be something you're ever going to receive, but it's a growing area. So if you are offered a donation, before you accept that donation of a crypto asset, you need to understand the risks. So the risks obviously involved are they've got very volatile values, the more risk of fraud or theft, and that there's a lack of protection compared to traditional currencies because it's not regulated. And there could be difficulties in tracing donors. So with crypto assets, large donations can be made without which are completely anonymous, but as a charity, you're required to know where those donations are coming from. And then also there's the limitations on using any crypto assets. Obviously, few retailers actually accept those as payments. So the guidance states that you need to make sure that if you are going to be involved within crypto assets, you need to have the expertise to manage those risks and adopt a policy. And that policy needs to cover accepting, refusing, using and converting those crypto assets. Another new area wasn't around when the last guidance came out is in relation to mobile payment systems, so Apple Pay and Google Pay, and the fact that the same controls need to be made in place with these payments as any other payments that your charity makes. So obviously, because under these systems, you can just go and pay using your thumbprint, your face, or even just your watch to make payments. And it's just being aware that you need to have a policy in place of this, because any person within your organisation who has a bank card for the charity potentially could set up Apple Pay or Google Pay on their devices with that bank card. So it's making sure you've got a system in place that if you don't want this happening, and having a policy and controls to make sure that it's not. Okay, so the other piece of redesigned guidance is CC14, investing charity money. So obviously, as a recap, your principal duty as trustees is to further your charity's purposes. And so any investments decisions made also need to be to further your purposes. So also, any investment decisions also need to follow the principles of good decision making. So I've linked those in here. So those aren't within this new guidance. Those are the principles of good decision making that any decision that your charity makes needs to follow. And it also clarifies you need to ensure you are complying with investment powers. So those are the investment powers that are either within law or within your governing document. So if you are investing any money, make sure you're checking your governing document to see whether there's any limitations on what you can and can't invest in. And with all of your policies, make sure you're keeping your investment approach under regular review for any changes that should be made. So just overall, all investments need to be within your charity's best interests. This is looking at not just what is best for your charity today, it's about fulfilling those purposes for those current beneficiaries and those future beneficiaries. And it's not about just preserving your charity for the charity's own sake, it's about your beneficiaries and impacting the highest number of beneficiaries as you can. So the key changes in this new guidance is there's more clarification over discretion of the trustees to delegate decision-making. So this is in relation to investment managers. There's a lot of information in the new guidance about saying about how to pick your investment manager and how to monitor their performance and decisions that can be made. Again, with everything, even if you are delegating to an investment manager or to a particular trustee who has investment knowledge, it remains the responsibility of all trustees equally to manage those investment decisions. So also all of the references to ethical, responsible, mixed motive and programme related investments has now been removed from the guidance, and this has been replaced with one heading of social investments. So this means that when you're making your investing decisions, you don't need to consider these areas separately. They all follow the same rules now, as they're all classed as the same category. There's also a lot more detail within the guidance about how to set your investment policies and ideas within there. So it's probably worth a read if you are investing. One thing it does highlight, though, is making sure that you keep a record of how any investment decisions are reached, and that one is retained with your charity's records. So with the removal of all of the mixed motive investments and things like that, there's now only the two types of financial investment that are within the guidance, which are financial investments or social investments. So your financial investments are made with an aim to generate income or increase in value with an element of capital growth. So when making these investment decisions, you need to be considering the risk of those investments and the return that you'll be getting for them, but also any conflicts. So, for example, if you, the obvious ones are for healthcare or environmental charities wouldn't want to be investing within businesses which are tobacco businesses, companies which cause obesity, or environmental charities probably don't want to be investing in fossil fuels. You also, though, need to keep in mind the wider ESG, so the environmental, social and governance policies surrounding the companies you're investing in, because actually do the companies you're investing in actually have the same ethos as you, or do they have things that they are doing that do not meet or fit well with your charity's objectives and your focus. So social investments are investments which are twofold, therefore achieving your charity's purpose and in addition make a financial return. So the financial return this relates to, it could be as simple as just receiving back the same money that you put into the investment and not making any surplus on that. So for example, that could be, so if you issue a loan to an organisation who has in a similar field, so that they potentially, so you issue a loan, interest-free loan, so they can progress your charitable purposes while doing theirs. And the financial return is over a period of time, you're going to receive the original money back. Obviously, that one doesn't give you any gain in terms of money coming in, but it's a part of your achieving your objectives. So where things were classed as programme-related or mixed motive investments, so where they're not in the guidance anymore, it is still important to, if you have those investments identified, that you are still aware that's what they're categorised as, because the charity SORP hasn't changed at the moment, so they still treat those differently. So we just need to be aware of that for accounting treatment. So overall, with your social investments, the guidance basically says that you need to balance the interests of your charity between fulfilling its charitable purposes and any financial return. But there's a lot more information within that guidance if you have investments that you can use to help make those decisions. So the next update I'm going to cover is the My Charity Commission account. So this is the new online service where you can update your charity's details and submit your annual accounts. So out of interest, how many people here have successfully set up their My Charity Commission account? Okay, super, not particularly many. And of those people, how many of you have you set it up with no issues at all? What? No, not very many at all. It doesn't surprise me because everybody I am speaking to has had huge issues with setting up their My Charity Commission accounts. The first hurdle is who is your main charity contact, so who received that first email asking you to set up the account, whether it's someone who's still in your organisation or whether it's the correct email address is one thing, or whether it was missed and the link expired. As soon as you're in that situation, it's contacting the Charity Commission to try and access that account. And anyone who has tried to do that, you may well find yourself on hold for over an hour trying to speak to somebody. So this is something that we're seeing everywhere with everyone. So if you haven't started setting up that account, I would recommend you try and do so sooner rather than later, especially if you've got a filing deadline coming up. My colleague Rebecca has a little video that she has made with some hints and tips of how to set up that account and how to give professional advisors access. So that's going to be linked into the slides, and it's also available on our website if you do wish to watch that. But one thing that the Charity Commission have said that if your filing of your annual accounts is late due to not being able to set up your account, if you let them know, which I believe you can do by email, they will remove any late filing flags that are on the public record. So moving on from that, so on the Charity Commission, so in July they published their customer survey satisfaction report, and at that time they had 69% of people rated the Charity Commission to be good. Of 30% of those was very good with the service they're receiving. Personally, I'll be interested to see what this looks like next year with this My Charity Commission account. But interestingly, this is only based on 1,003 responses. So if you have had issues with setting up your account and you receive a customer satisfaction survey, I would recommend that you complete it because they're not going to be aware of the issues unless we tell them. So now moving on to some tax updates. So there's nothing major in the tax updates, but there are a few minor clarifications. So in relation to gift aid, first of all, if you are operating the retail gift aid scheme, there are now new simplified year-end letters that can be used if you're using the de minimis option. So this means in some situations, if donations are below £20, you only need a letter every 3 years instead of every year. But there's certain things you need to put in place to make sure to be able to qualify for that. It's been clarified that crypto assets are not considered could be currency or money. So this means that any crypto asset donations do not qualify for gift aid. So if someone wants to gift aid a crypto asset donation, they have to convert that into traditional currency in the hands of the donor before it is transferred across. And then it's also been clarified that if you have if a loan or a refund or a loan repayment is waived, it can be considered as a donation for gift aid, but you just need to make sure that there's a clear agreement to cancel that loan and not accept a refund in order to qualify. And then earlier in the year at the spring budget, it was announced that there is going to be a restriction to the tax reliefs received to non-UK charities. So this is EU and EEA charities who previously qualified for the same as UK charities. So this is to ensure that UK taxpayers' money is going to be used to support UK charities and community amateur sports clubs going forward. So I think this comes in from April 2024. So earlier this year, there was a consultation about charities' tax compliance, and so basically this is because more than 5.5 billion in charitable reliefs in 2020 to 2021 were given. Of this, 1.3 billion of gift aid and business rates relief of 2.4 billion. So obviously these are big numbers, so the HMRC want to making sure that these are reaching the right organisations. So what they're looking to do is tackle non-compliance and to protect the integrity of the sector. And there's 4 main areas that they've looked at in this consultation of where they can tighten up the rules for non-compliance. The first one is in relation to tainted charity donations. So these rules are there to prevent donors receiving a financial advantage from a donation. So this doesn't cover gift aid. So gift aid is fine as long as you're within those gift aid benefit limits. But so they only fall in as a tainted donation if all 3 of these conditions are met about the donation and benefit being connected. I won't go through those, but I will show you an example. So an example where at the moment that can fall through is where a donor makes a significant donation to a charity. The donor and the charity both get tax relief on that donation, and then that donation could be reinvested back into a company controlled by the donor. So in that situation, the charity is not getting any benefit out of that apart from the tax relief on the gift aid. So it's not really what these rules were designed for, and HMRC are looking at how that they can tighten this up. So the options they're considering are to just remove and replace with a completely new rule. Oh, skipped ahead. Removing the requirement to demonstrate that it's made to benefit the donor, which will give them more power to be able to question more donations. Or replacing financial advantage with financial assistance or benefit, which again gives them more power to question a high proportion of donations that are made. So obviously, if you're not having these donations where you're getting benefit, it's not going to affect you, but it is going to be a good thing if they bring it in, which means that the tax reliefs are reaching the right organisations. So the next area that's is being looked at is the charity investment rules trying to prevent abuse. So at the moment, as it stands, most investment income is not taxable. So things like interest, dividends, property rental income, all of that is automatically exempt from tax. So, however, cases have been seen where, for example, a foreign property was purchased by a charity, which was used as a holiday home by the trustees. So clearly this has no charity benefit and is not really what these rules are for. But HMRC didn't have any power to question this activity on the basis that the purchase of a property is an automatically exempt transaction because it's approved investment within law. Obviously, the Charity Commission would probably have some issues with this and could raise some concerns, but from HMRC's objective, tax reliefs being obtained, which they can't question. So what they're looking to do is update the rules to ensure that all approved investments have to be for the benefit of a charity. So then the third area they're looking at is in relation to non-charitable expenditure. So as the rules currently stand, HMRC think it is possible for a donor to receive tax relief for a donation, the charity not to pay any tax, and then the charity to spend the money on something other than its charitable purposes. So this is because if a charity has non-charitable expenditure, the equivalent amount of income then becomes taxable, which is how HMRC then get their tax. The problem is certain types of income never can become taxable. Something like legacy income can't become taxable. So if the charity doesn't have enough income that can become taxable, then they can't collect the tax charge. So they're looking to tighten up the rules here of the definitions behind which income can and can't become taxable. And the last area that they are consulting on is sanctioning charities for late filing and non-compliance. And the options that they are considering is withholding gift aid payments or disapplying other